If you want to create more goods in general for the future, you need more investment. If the humans are useless, then it's better for them just to leave that economy. Everyone starts their life with a very equal footing, equal opportunities. Machines can't replace humans because machines don't know what humans want.
Hi, I'm Greg Mustreader, and this is my podcast on rationality, transhumanism, and trends of development in society. Today, here with me is Udara Peiris, a member of the Research Advisory Board of the Central Bank of Russia, an Oxford graduate, a brilliant economist. Hi, Udara.
Hi, Greg.
Well, today I'd love to ask a lot of dumb questions about economy and where it's all headed, how it all works. I've recently seen your Zoom conference with other notable economists discussing perspectives of the economy post-COVID. First question, are you generally optimistic about the coming months and the coming couple of years? Will there be growth, in your opinion?
As the answer you'd get from most economists is the answer is it's not clear. And it's not clear in the sense, the simple answer is that this current crisis is not like the global financial crisis, because it's caused essentially by government policy. And for health reasons, the governments have said people can't go to work, and that's what's caused the economic downturn. So then, of course, if you remove this restriction, then the economy will bounce back. However, this period in which businesses were closed has led to people losing their jobs. It has led to people who are working, their wages to go down. And this has then caused certain industries to decline. Now, the way the modern economy works, it's not you buy a good from a shop. There's an entire supply chain behind each product. There's a interesting video on YouTube about how much it costs to produce your own sandwich.
How much?
I think the cost was several $100s. And this was basically replicating the entire supply chain. And so, when the economy stops, this entire supply chain stops. And then if there are certain parts of this supply chain which are affected, then the entire supply chain is affected. So things like, the logistics services, the ingredients manufacturers, the R&D facilities. And so if there are certain parts of it that start getting affected, then it takes much more time for the economy to bounce back. So what we've seen, because essentially the global economy has been depressed for about 3 months, there has been a lot of layoffs. There's been a lot of reorganization, restructuring. As most of your listeners would be aware, they would have spent more time buying things from online shops. And so all of these changes will have at least a medium-term effect. And so the simple answer is that the economy will bounce back once these restrictions are undone, but there will be sort of a prolonged effect, a slower recovery after this, trying to get back to the original position. So the catchphrase that's been used is to ask whether this will be a V-shaped recovery, whether the economy will go down and bounce back. As my guest online panel discussion, Oleg Zamulin, who's the head of research at Sberbank, said it's more likely to be a crooked V recovery, which means that it'll bounce back, but then at a certain point it'll grow back gradually. So I think that's what we should all be expecting, that things will get better, but they won't get back to where they were very soon. The other aspect, I think, which is very important about this current crisis is that it's global, and it's also associated with significant political changes around the world. And how these political changes will play out will also affect the way the economy will the global economy will move going forward.
You mostly mean the situation in the US?
I mean, definitely the situation in the US. They have a big election coming up. But also, in China, the way the Chinese government will move forward. Don't forget the UK has just come out of Brexit, has just come out of the European Union, and they're negotiating trade deals. So even today they're negotiating their first post-Brexit trade deal with Japan. And so all of these things take time. So really we're living in very, very interesting times. The world has very much changed from what it was in the late 90s. It's a new world with different ways of doing business, different poles of power. And the certainty that we had before is very much gone. And we're sort of trying to work out it's a more of a short, medium term, how to best position ourselves. I think that's the best we can do.
What if this situation becomes permanent? What if this virus becomes the new reality? We don't find the vaccine. Imagine this. How will the economy bounce back, and will it?
So if you take the worst case scenario, that suppose that the governments did nothing, and the mortality rates that we're going to get out of this are going to be significantly higher than the standard flu, but it's not targeting young healthy people who are going to be the most economically productive group of people. So that means that in terms of economic output, the effect would be limited. This is going to have significant issues in terms of the health system. It's going to have significant issues in terms of the political system, because, mind you, most people in the political system are in the older age group.
Yeah.
But in terms of pure economic activity, it's not going to have that much of an effect.
So people dying, it is not such a huge impact on the economy.
Not to the extent of previous pandemics in the past. So the Spanish flu, for example, the Spanish flu killed more people, more American soldiers getting to Europe than actually died in Europe in World War One.
Yeah, I think it took like dozens of millions of lives.
Yeah, I think it was 50-60 million. So in terms of that, there's no evidence that the severity of this is that high, especially for younger age people.
But still, people will be afraid, to go out to consume, to spend money.
Yeah, people will be afraid or more cautious to engage in the activities they were doing before. But I think there'll be a switching. There's rather than going to a bar or a pub with lots of people, they may have a smaller group of friends. They may entertain at home or in a park. And in terms of how much they spend, it really depends on how much they earn. So as long as there's economic activity which supports these changing preferences, there's no reason why the economy should go down a lot significantly. It's not how much people spend depends on how much they earn, and how much they earn depends on how much they spend. So as long as people produce goods that are needed, we shouldn't see such a decline. But there's definitely going to be a short to medium term effect of this switching.
Which other trends of development of the economy, of the global economy, would you highlight as the most important for the coming years?
So I teach an international finance course to my master's students at the High School of Economics. And in the first lecture I asked them, if you look at world trade as a percentage of world GDP in 1901 or 07, in what year did the world reach that again? And the answer was actually 1990.
Mm-hmm.
So the world was very integrated. There was a lot of global trade going on in the late 1800s. And it's to do with the fact that in the late 1800s, the US started entering in the world markets. One from commodities such as meat and agriculture, and the second from oil. And so these two things meant that the US was very much engaged in world trade, and they were the ones that ended up financing much of the First and Second World War because they were running current account surpluses in that period. So what happened in the intervening years was wars, the Cold War, and once the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union fell, the world became more integrated. But there's no reason why this is a permanent move. And what we see, not just from Trump, but we see from Brexit, we see from movements within Europe. It's going back to this idea of the national economy, domestic production, and having less international trade. And the simple answer is say this is just populism, nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at what's causing this, if you look in the US, the classic statistic is to look at the wages of blue-collar workers. They've barely increased since the 70s in real terms. Whereas if you look at the white-collar workers, if you look at CEOs, they've increased astronomically, but if you look at educated white-collar workers, they've increased a lot. And so, what we've seen is that the increase in income inequality is what's driving this nationalism, which is driving protectionism. And I think this is something that will be very difficult to undo.
What are the possible ways to undo this? Because everybody's talking about how much inequality there is, especially in the US and some other countries. This rift grows even deeper. What should we do?
So I think the reason why it hasn't been such an issue until recently is because the entrance of China to the global labor market. And that has meant that there was a lot of consumer goods which became very cheap. So even though real incomes didn't increase, people were able to afford to live, and properties were increasing, but they were able to borrow from the bank. So the people's lives, they could feel were improving even though their real wages weren't increasing. Now, since China has started to really move up the income ladder, the wages have increased. So actually, the wages in Russia are lower than the wages in China right now. And so that will tell you that the cost of Chinese goods will be going up and are going up. And, what I'm trying to say here is that the easy solution that we had before is not really there. I mean, perhaps Africa, which has enough people to enter into the labor market, a lot of young people, could provide these goods. But in the absence of that, then we're back to this issue of what to do about this income inequality. So an interesting fact, there was a discussion about the French Revolution, and it's often thought that revolutions occur following periods of declines in income, national income. But it seems, it's not a sort of a proven thing, but it seems that actually it's the opposite. It's periods of income growth followed by stagnation that cause the revolution. And the argument is that it's because people get used to their incomes growing, and then when it stops growing, they feel what they're missing out on. So
that's interesting.
When people don't feel there's any hope that their lives can get better, there's nothing to fight for. But once they feel there is a possibility of it, that's when they demand change. Then I guess the deeper question is, what is the possible change that can happen? There's many reasons why the Western, if you want to call it the capitalist economy, is deeply flawed. And some of it's to do with the way the taxation system is set up, some to do with the way there's political capture. But it promotes oligarchism. People that it's easy for people. Once people move past a certain threshold, it's much easier for them to keep accumulating wealth. So one possibility out of this is this German model where, if you take a standard Western corporate charter and you talk about who is on the board of directors, it's the shareholders, right? And they're the ones that decide. In Germany, the workers are actually part of the board and they have decision making. They're representatives there. And this, I think, goes back to the argument of Marx, many of his arguments are intuitively appealing, but it's very difficult to write down a formal argument for. At least I found it difficult to. But the idea is that, if everything was fair, you'd give all the factors of production what they deserve, which is the marginal product, how much each additional person can produce for the company. So this is all well and fair, but it depends who's deciding this. Okay, so if, of course, everyone that's deciding this is the owners of production, then you can think of a situation where all of the owners are somehow colluding to take more. The reason why this argument is flawed is that companies compete against each other. So you'd think that with a degree of competition that workers' wages would go up. So I don't think that going to this sort of direction of diminishing or restricting the roles of the owners of capital is the way forward. I have personally a lot of sympathy for a state-run or state-owned, managed, influenced economy, to the extent that the private sector is able to manage it. Because in this sense, if the shareholder is the state, then there's a sort of social obligation behind it. But what we don't want in a situation where individual entrepreneurship and progress is stymied, because the reason why capitalism is so appealing and so successful is that each person can see the inefficiencies around them, and it's up to each person to try and has the opportunity to take advantage of this, and in doing so they make a profit. And so once you start restricting people's ability to make money out of this, you start creating a more and more inefficient system. So I think I've gone around in circles a bit to answer your question, but in terms of where we go here, I do have some sympathy for having corporate decisions include the welfare of the workers, the employees. I do think that the tax systems are very much biased towards owners, the wealthy. So even if you remove all these tax havens, it's much easier for people that own businesses to reduce the amount of effective tax that they pay. And also inheritance. This is something that is not such an issue in Russia right now because most of the wealth was made one generation ago. But in the US, you have multiple generations that are living off the wealth accumulated from the past. And a very nice set of videos with Milton Friedman where somebody asked, isn't this unfair that the children get huge inheritance from their parents? And they asked, suppose that the parents of so two people get together, a man and a woman, and one is a brilliant musician and the other is a brilliant physicist, and they have a child. So isn't it unfair that this child has great genes from the parents? So he says this is the same thing as giving wealth. So I disagree with this. I think that there should be a limit, a restriction on how much money should be able to be transferred across. I think all wealth in the end is a public good, right? I think everything belongs to the world, how abstractly you define it. But there are sort of specific things that can be done that can help in terms of at this level. And this is sort of the level most people talk about. I think in at least the developed countries, the Western countries, things like opportunity at an early age matters a lot. For example, giving mothers access to childcare, paying for free childcare, giving health, also access to good public schools and access to universities. So once people have fairly equal access to these things, you create a more equal society. I grew up in Australia, and in many ways Australia developed, at least until recently, maybe it still is, into a fairly equal society. Of course, there is still the ultra rich, actually, that were created out of the mining boom, but putting that aside, it's a very equal society, because even if you're rich, you're not like multiples richer than others, and most people can have a decent quality of life regardless of the profession they do. Many of the blue-skilled jobs are very highly paid. For example, plumbers earn more than professors sometimes over there. And that has a lot to do with having a very good education system, from the school level to university. To get into university, there's lots of universities, and also the government gives loans. There's public health care, there's childcare facilities, and public transport. At least it used to be fairly cheap. So I think these are kind of the prerequisites to think about giving equal opportunity to people regardless of where they were born.
So the accessibility of all those public goods.
Yeah.
But what exactly can governments do to reduce inequality, apart from providing equal opportunities in terms of childcare, public transport, etc.? I didn't really understand whether you are in favor of like progressive taxation or other measures that some would say lean towards socialism a little bit, or are you against them?
I haven't got a clear... I can't give you a simple answer for this. The problem with progressive taxation is that you're kind of harming the people that are producing the most for the economy. And it's not the people it targets and affects is not the upper class, it's not the rich, it's the middle class and the upper middle class.
They suffer most.
They're the ones that are affected by progressive taxation. So the professional, in Russia this is not the case, unfortunately, but UK and the US, doctors generally earn a lot. So if they work harder, they run their own practice or do multiple consultancies in different hospitals, they can earn quite a lot, and very quickly they reach the top tax bracket. Same with investment bankers,
lawyers,
consultants, and maybe you don't like these professions, but the people that are in these professions typically are not ones that are born with a silver spoon in their mouth. They're just...
Yeah, it's hard work.
Yeah,
I used to work at an international law consultancy firm, so I know it.
So you don't want to discourage people from going into these professions through having a taxation system that's skewed in this way.
Are they really discouraged by that fact? I've heard multiple times people from upper middle class or people who earn quite a lot of money. I've heard them say, "I'm all for progressive taxation. Tax me even more. I want to share my money with the needy."
Yeah, I suspect this is a minority, because once you're after a certain level, perhaps it doesn't matter. At least sort of people that I know that have worked themselves up through the ladder, they're very much disappointed by the fact they're at a career point where everything that they earn is now 50 to 60% taken by the government. And they're saying, why should I be working 100 hours a week doing this, and where I can work less, have a more comfortable life, and earn less. And then as society, we have to see whether it's worth this difference. It's easy to say, like, let's punish them, but they have an option to work less, and maybe that's going to be less efficient. So yeah, I don't think this is necessarily the right way to go. Taxing wealth may be a better way to go.
So taxing extremely wealthy people.
Yeah, we have to be careful again defining what is extremely wealthy, because in Australia, where very few people were born wealthy, almost everybody that owns a home is now a millionaire, right? Just because the property prices have increased. So then, in that situation, who is wealthy? Same in Moscow, right? People that were inherited an apartment are suddenly very wealthy, and should we tax them? Is it because of some unfair system that they got this? And if you tax them but they don't have the cash to pay, then you have a problem as well.
So how should it work? Am I right to assume that taxing wealth is opposed to taxing income, because you tax like the net worth of a person, right?
Yeah, so taxing the net wealth is then you're better able to judge who is in a more privileged position to give to others. And the second thing is, but even then you have to be careful, because, suppose that you could decide whether to tax someone's income or to tax someone's wealth. If people have more money to spend, so you don't tax their income, this is then good for the economy because they're spending more, which means there's more jobs, okay, more income for somebody else. If you're taxing somebody's wealth, on the other hand, what is wealth? Wealth is savings, which is being used for investment, right? So if you tax wealth, what you're going to do is then reduce the amount of investment in the economy. You're going to raise interest rates, right?
And people will just spend that money on goods but not invest.
Exactly. And if you want to create more goods in general for the future, you need more investment. So, there's no, this is why I find economics so fascinating, that there's no real easy answers here on how to move forward. So it's very much a decision on which negative outcome are we willing to bear the most.
Choosing between different types of evil.
Exactly. Which evil do we prefer? Yeah. So, just to summarize my point, I don't believe there's an easy answer here. I think and we don't want to make these economic statements based on a political ideology or political goal. We want to be clear what will be the consequences of these decisions. Maybe this is what we want. Maybe we want to take all the wealth from the rich and give it to the poor. Maybe we want to give it to the state, but I think we should, as a society, be aware of what all these trade-offs are, and understand whether the consequences are something that we actually would want to accept.
Unfortunately, I think economic measures have always been influenced by political considerations, and I think that has been quite often the main purpose, attaining some political goal. That's why the economy is such a strange and complicated thing.
Yeah, the economy is just you and I. It's people. It's not a machine. It's not like some rich fat guy, smoking a cigar. It's really just ordinary people. And ordinary people aren't objects in a machine. They have hopes and dreams and incentives and weaknesses, and all these considerations need to be included when you decide what is right. But I think the things which are irrefutable, I think, is really to make sure that everyone starts their life with a very equal footing, equal opportunities. And that means, especially in Russia, investing in universities, investing in schools. And this is something that, one generation may miss out, but in the longer run, this is what will pay off better. And investing in hospitals, hospitals and education.
What would you say is the most efficient economic system today? which country has the most successful and efficient economy?
Well, efficiency, just means given the amount of resources, given a set of resources, what system produces the most. And I would say that it would be the US, because the US is extremely flexible, the people are extremely hardworking, and it moves very quickly, they're very innovative. So there's a lot to admire about the American system, even though it has a lot of flaws. If you move into the Asian system, the Japanese, the Chinese, it's much more regimented. It's less innovative at an individual level, but it's successful because each person specializes much more to a greater degree, and you get gains from just everyone doing a smaller task but more repetitively. But it's not really the way forward, I think. I tell.
So you don't think that the Chinese economy is more efficient?
I don't think it's the system that even they are aspiring to, because you can't sustain a system where everyone is just doing mechanical tasks. The only way to really increase prosperity is for to have an economy that's very capital intensive, which is so the machines are producing lots of goods with less workers. And that means each worker has to be more creative, more able, more flexible. I always tell my students that, forget about just solving problems, doing all of this mental gymnastics.
Mm-hmm.
There'll always be somebody that's better than you out there that can solve a problem, solve a puzzle. But what's really valued in the job market and what will help their career is the ability to abstract, which means to see, take a very complicated situation in the real world, break it down to its components, to see how all of these components work together, and then to provide a solution. And even going beyond this, it's to identify what are the potential risks, potential problems that can occur. And I tell them that the people that are the most valuable in any company are the people that have this ability. Because you can always get somebody else to solve the problem. But to get somebody that understands a problem, it's much more rare. So I think this reflects just the way that the greatest value people have over machines is our ability to be creative.
Well, for the time being.
For the time, yeah.
You mentioned the AI. What do you think will happen when the machines learn to do everything we can do? Will there be like universal basic income for people and they will not work at all?
It's very hard to think that far ahead. So the first question is whether machines will replace humans, and machines can't replace humans because machines don't know what humans want, right? Because they're not humans.
Well, in some aspects they are already replacing humans.
But they don't know what humans want.
Yeah, they are programmed to predict.
Yeah. So now the more that machines can take on these more complicated human tasks, the more productive an individual person should be. At least that's the idea. That means bringing AI should make everyone wealthier. However, there will be a transition period where the people whose jobs are being replaced are much worse off. And the question is, what do we do about those people?
Yeah, like truck drivers. There will be no truck drivers in 10 years.
Yeah, and it becomes very difficult for someone to retrain after they spent 20, 30 years doing a single job. So then, who's there to support them? What else can they do? And, the easy answer is to say that the state should step in. But at the end of the day, there's I don't think people would ever want to just, sit at home and do nothing. People always, the nature of humanity is to be inquisitive.
Yeah, they will find something to occupy themselves with.
Yeah.
But not necessarily for money.
Well, they have to trade, right? Unless we're in a perfect socialist system where everyone gets the same amount of salary. You'll still have to be able to give something to get something. So the principle of trade will always be there.
But what if machines become more efficient, more productive than humans in every imaginable area? So it's impossible for you to out-compete the machine. So you just cannot earn money other than just receive some subsidies, pensions.
But who owns the machines?
I don't know. The corporations probably. Or the governments.
Who owns the corporations?
People.
So in the end, and who controls the government? It's people. It may not be your people, but it will be people. So then we're still back to the same, political issues that we have now.
And this will lead to even greater inequality, right? Those who control the all-powerful AI will reap all the rewards.
It's hard to believe we'll end up in that sort of system, in a complete enslavement. People will just not be happy and not accept this.
So Luddites, new movements to fight with technology, to destroy machines?
If the humans, let me put it this way, suppose that the humans are useless. If the humans are useless, then it's better for them just to leave that economy and start their own economy.
How would that work?
Well, they can just go into their own farm and...
downshifting.
Yeah, they can have their own little kibbutz, as they used to have. And, they can then trade with each other again. So either people are useful or they're not useful. If they're useful, that means they'll be able to trade with the production of the machines. If they're not useful, they'll just leave this economy and...
So they can't stay?
But how they earn money?
Universal basic income, for example. I've heard that experiments in some countries have shown that this may be effective. Certain amount of money every month that is enough to get by, to have all the basic needs covered.
Okay, so we can take a more come back to reality.
Okay.
And, so in terms of universal basic income, so it's been tried in several Northern European countries, Scandinavian countries, as well as in the US. There's two forms of this. One is unemployment benefits, and the second is in terms of minimum wages, which they call the living wage. The unemployment benefits was, I think, at least what I've seen in Scandinavia, it was appreciated by the people that were receiving them, but it didn't seem to lead to any better outcome for them in terms of their job prospects.
But they had money, so that was better for them than nothing.
Yes, but people's dignity depends on their work, and the inability to find work is really something they don't want. So giving people money without a job is not... It's not really it's a job, it's the purpose that people are looking for. And to give them a job, it gives people's dignity, a purpose in life. And that's why the market and the economy is so important. It's not really just a source of money. In the US, this is much more accentuated. So if you spend any significant time there, you get the sense that people's value... the perception of their own value comes from how they interact in the market.
Yeah.
And it's not so much a nominal thing where they're trying to show off how much they earn. It's really that they're very proud that they're earning this because it reflects how much they're contributing to society. They very much judge themselves on whether the amount of money they earn today has been justified. So I think that's the right way to think about it. It's the Protestant work ethic.
Yeah. You don't think it will change? For example, with the automatization of most jobs, people will no longer feel that they need to have a job, at least in the conventional sense. to have their life purpose fulfilled. Maybe they will do something like create some art. They will not just stay at home and play video games, but jobs will not be attached to self-actualization any longer. Do you find this plausible?
Well, I can speak from my personal experience. So my decision to become a professor is not based on salary or income.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of my genuine passion and desire to learn and understand about the world, as well as to be able to contribute to the lives of young people. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I think many people choose their professions. At least I tell my students to choose their professions based on what they're passionate about doing, and to treat their job like their hobby. So I think in that sense, what they earn becomes irrelevant. So there'll always be stuff for people to do. If they're passionate about being an artist, they'll do that. But it's always very sad when people feel that they're stuck doing a certain job for the sake of earning money.
And I think most people are. Most people feel this way.
Unfortunately, there'll be a lot of people, yes. And there's always ways they can improve their situation. There's always ways they can make the situation better. They may not be able, most people won't be able to change their jobs straight away or their careers, but at least within that job they can find things that bring them joy. Because if you really hate your job, it's like being in prison, right? It's so I think most people that do have their job, they can find joy from this task, whatever that task is. So that's why I think this idea that once we have AI and robots that humans will have nothing to do is not true, because we always want to do something. It's fundamental to our dignity.
What would you recommend people who want to understand more about economics, to understand the economic trends better, but don't have the fundamental economic education?
So in terms of reading material, I would suggest the Financial Times and the Economist. They're very much kind of, especially the Economist, you would say it's right-leaning. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, their analysis is usually very clear, and you can understand what they're trying to say and why. Whereas in a lot of other newspapers, it's not really quite clear what the economic argument they're making. In terms of other sources, it's always I found it fascinating personally to watch all these clips of Milton Friedman speaking on YouTube, and there's like mini interviews where like students are asking questions, and the questions that they ask are very much relevant today, and he'll give an answer which will surprise you. You may disagree all of the time, but it'll definitely get you to think. Hayek, who's a famous Austrian economist, there's several YouTube videos of his which will also just surprise you, and I think that's a useful exercise to kind of challenge the way you're thinking about the world. There's a famous book by Hayek called The Road to Serfdom, and in that he says that he had a conversation with somebody, and it was along the lines that if you take the roads in Germany, they're perfectly paved and beautiful. And if you take the roads in England, they're full of potholes and they're broken. And so they ask which system is more efficient. And he says the English one, because in the German one they're spending too much on roads. Right? So then, it really gets you to think about what is the right way to think about the problem. Is it really obvious? And that sort of sharpens your intuition.
Well, I'm sure that's very valuable recommendations. All the links to the books and videos and other sources mentioned in this podcast, as usual, will be in the description of the video version of this podcast on YouTube. And if you listen to the audio version of this podcast, the links will be in the description of the podcasting platform that you listen to, that you use. Udara, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Please, if you like this video, click the like button, click the subscribe button, and ding the bell button not to miss further videos on my YouTube channel. If you liked my podcast on audio platforms, please write a review. I read all the reviews, and please rate this podcast, and see you next week. So thank you so much.
Thank you.